All right, so the first thing we'll talk about is aortic stenosis. Okay, what this is so here's, and we'll learn about this in the slides a little bit later. This is the left ventricle. Okay, what this is that it's a pump. Okay, so blood from the lungs comes to the right atrium. This is oxygenated blood, and now you got to send that oxygenated blood to all the body. Okay? So the cells need oxygen. So from the right atrium, it comes to the left ventricle, and when the left ventricle compresses, it pumps this blood to around the body. Okay? So the blood goes around the body. So this is your strongest pump. Okay, your heart is essentially two pumps. Here's the right ventricle that sends the blood to the lungs to get oxygenated, but this is not that strong a pump because the blood doesn't need to go too far. This is your strongest pump. Okay? And there's a valve here. Okay? The valve prevents the blood from this. All the valves are one-way valves, so this valve only lets blood go through like that. It prevents blood flowing back into the ventricle. Okay. Here's a end-on view of the valve. And when the left ventricle compresses, this valve opens up, okay, and the blood flows. Okay. Now, if the valve opens up nice and wide, then the blood flows properly. Now, this valve can get diseased, okay, and you see here's a diseased valve, and it's not opening fully. Okay, how do we detect a diseased valve is the question. Yep.
You can tell by checking with the stethoscope. There's variations in the sound of how the blood flows through the
Right.
aortic valve.
Right. So that's one technique. Okay, so here's the sonography program that some of people are interested in here. What you can do is measure the blood velocity. Okay, this is a technique called echocardiography. Okay, and we'll get to the stethoscope comment in a little bit when we talk about turbulence. Okay. So the echocardiography can measure the speed of blood flow. So you can't see this. Okay, you detect this condition indirectly. So you measure the blood velocity here. You measure the blood velocity here and here. Okay, so V after, or we'll call it V2, V1. Okay, so you can measure the blood velocity before the valve and after the valve. Okay, so now let's look at this. So here's how this thing is detected. Okay, so you've seen this equation before. This is called okay, this is called the equation of continuity. What this is saying is the following. Okay, see, let's say if 2 liters of blood are flowing a second, at this location, if there's no leak, there's 2 liters of blood flowing there a second. Okay, so that's what this is, the volume flow rate. Okay, the speed of the blood times the area of cross section of the pipe is equal to the speed somewhere else times the area of cross section. All it's saying is whatever blood is flowing here is flowing out there. Okay, so if a blood vessel narrows, or whatever opening narrows, if this thing narrows, if this thing becomes smaller, then the blood flows faster. Okay? And remember, you can measure, you can't see this, but what you can do is using echocardiography, you can measure the blood speed. All right, now here's the deal. So you can measure the blood speed, and if the speed is too much, then that means if the blood is flowing too fast, that means the aortic valve has, there's stenosis in the aortic valve. Okay, so the speed tells you that. Okay, and then so here's another equation. This is okay. So this is Bernoulli's equation. What this tells you is if the speed increases at a given location, what this equation is telling you is the pressure at a given location plus the kinetic energy per unit volume at a given location. These two, the sum of these two are constant. So if a fluid flows faster, if the speed increases, the pressure at that location decreases. Okay. A faster flowing fluid at that location, the pressure is lower. Okay. That's Bernoulli's equation, and we've seen the effect of this equation elsewhere. Okay, so if the fluid is flowing too fast here, the pressure decreases. The pressure at this location decreases. So another proxy for the speed of a fluid is the pressure. Okay, so what doctors can say is if the pressure drops too much, that means if the blood is flowing too fast here, then that means the valve has narrowed. Okay. So another way of saying this is, another way of saying that speed has increased too much, meaning this valve the opening has decreased. If the pressure drops by 40 millimeters of mercury, that means you have stenosis. Okay? So the drop in pressure is a proxy for how much the blood is sped up. Okay? So again, you're not looking at this valve. What you're doing is measuring the speed of blood using echocardiography. Okay, so here are the numbers on a problem. Okay, so you have stenosis if the pressure drops by 40 millimeters of mercury. Okay, so here's a problem. This is straight from your book. Okay, so the speed is measured before the valve. Upstream of the valve, it's 1.1 meters per second in a patient. And measurements show speed upstream of the valve and 3.5 meters just past the valve. Okay, so the speed here is measured to be 3.5 meters per second, and this is 1.1 meters per second. 1.1 meters per second is roughly the speed at which you walk. So 3.5 meters per second is 3 times that speed. Okay, so you're measuring these speeds. Okay, and now using P1 plus 1/2 rho V1 square equal to, this is Bernoulli's equation. P1 minus P2 is equal to 1/2 rho V2 square minus. Don't worry about the math, but that's so. Remember, you measured this speed, that's what that speed is, and this speed is that. So you get the pressure drop. You're just calculating the pressure drop as a proxy for that. Okay, this is what you're measuring. Okay, so if you calculate the pressure drop, it turns out to be 44 millimeter of mercury. Okay, that means the speed has increased too much. That means the valve is narrowed. Okay, the valve is diseased. Okay, so so the threshold is okay. Does the patient meet the criterion for severe aortic stenosis? Okay, so blood pressure, which we'll look at more closely, is measured in millimeters of mercury. Okay, anyway, if the blood pressure drops below 40 millimeters of mercury, that means you have severe stenosis. Okay, so that's how they detect this stenosis. Again, all you're doing is measuring blood velocity before and after the valve, and from that you can tell if the valve is opening enough or not. Okay, and if the valve doesn't open enough, then this speed is too high. Okay, and that's so that's how. And if this blood flows too fast, it becomes turbulent, which can be you can hear using a stethoscope. Okay, so whenever a doctor uses a stethoscope, what they're listening for is if the blood flow is turbulent. Okay, every time, and Blood flow becomes turbulent if it's flowing too fast. Okay, you've heard turbulence in your kitchen. When you turn on the kitchen faucet and you hear the water coming, that's turbulence. Okay, if the water comes too fast, it becomes turbulent and it makes that noise. And that's what the doctors are using the stethoscopes to listen. Okay. All right. Till now, all these equations, this equation assumes that there's no friction in the fluid. Friction in the fluid is called viscosity. Okay. What does friction do? It slows things down, and what happened to the energy of the flow gets converted to heat. Okay, so if there's friction, so for instance, okay, so let's say you have a water tank up there, and you want to pump water from the ground to the tank, to the storage tank. What if you had to pump honey to the storage tank? Would you need more electricity?
Yeah.
Yeah. And why is that?
Because it would take more to get it to me.
Because there's more friction in honey. You need more energy. Okay? So if there is friction, you need energy to pump something. Okay? So if blood has friction, your heart has to work to pump the blood around the heart. Okay? Around your body. Okay, so now we'll take friction into account. So we'll talk about viscous fluids. Okay? And look at this. So here's the viscosity is denoted by this letter, eta. Okay? And this is the SI units. It's pascals per second. Those are the units for viscosity. Okay, so here's viscosity for water. It's about 1,000 in this unit. That's at 20 degrees. And here's the thing about viscosity. If you raise the temperature of the fluid, see the viscosity decreases. Okay. So this is about 0.5 times. So the viscosity of water has, when going from 20 to 60 degrees, has decreased by half. All right. Well, this kind of stuff has real consequences. You may or may not have heard of this. So we do pump oil in Alaska. In Alaska, it's very cold. Okay. So if you want to make oil flow like that, you have to have a higher pressure here, lower pressure here. Okay. And now if you want to pump 100 gallons a second, okay, you have to maintain a certain pressure difference. Okay. And this costs you money. The higher the pressure difference, the more electricity you're spending. So now in Alaska during the winter, when the oil is cold, the viscosity is higher. And it takes more energy to pump the oil, just like the water and honey example I gave you. So how can you decrease your pumping bills? The cost of pumping it.
If you were to heat the liquid.
If you were to heat the liquid, and they do exactly that. They have heaters around the pipe. Dude, what's that? Yeah, exactly. Okay, so now let's go one step further. When would you heat the oil? Well, if the money spent heating is less than the money spent pumping, then you'll heat it. Okay? So heating the oil and reducing the viscosity reduces your total electricity bill. So all this stuff has real consequences. Okay, anyway, so that's an example from the physical world. And let's see how we apply this to the human body. Okay, so viscosity in a fluid is resistance to flow. The viscosity of a fluid decreases rapidly with increase in temperature. So you heat a fluid, its viscosity decreases. Okay, so if you want, I haven't done this, but during the winter, when it's cold, the honey doesn't squeeze out of the bottle too much. Maybe you can stick it in the microwave for 30 seconds, and it probably will flow easier. I'm just suggesting. I don't know if it does anything. Yeah.
Yeah, you want to put the honey in a warm water bath.
Yeah. So yeah.
It's
Anyway,
the heat decreases its
viscosity.
effects. No, it's
F.
Kills the enzymes in it.
Yep, there you go.
Mm-hmm. And you will want to become an accountant, huh? All right.
I can see that was the one.
Yeah. No, that was the right one. Okay, so viscosity, temperature. Hey, I just.
Fair, it's fair.
Yeah, I'm a defective donut, so.
Hey, we came up with a good name for you, didn't we? All right, so viscosity decreases with increase in temperature. Okay. Now here is the effect of viscous flow. So here's a. Okay. If a fluid had no viscosity, the fluid is flowing in a pipe. You see, the speed of the fluid flow would be the same everywhere. If it's a viscous fluid, so water sort of flows like this, but honey flows like this in a tube. Look, it's flowing the fastest here, and it gets slower and slower as you go outward toward the tube. And at the edge of the tube, the honey is at rest. The fluid is almost not flowing. Well, why do we care about this? Well, think of blood. This blood is not flowing at all. And so stuff in the blood gets deposited in the inner walls of the blood vessels. That's how plaque get deposited. For blood moving through arteries, the fact that the fluid at the outer edges lingers and barely moves allows deposits to build up on the inside wall. Okay? So that's where plaque collects, okay? And that's how plaque collects, okay? So now let's define an average velocity. So let's say 2 liters a second are flowing in this thing. That's Q, that's the flow rate, divided by the area of cross-section of the tube. That's the average velocity. So you see the velocity of the fluid is changing here for viscous fluid across the area of cross-section. So we define the average velocity as flow rate divided by the area of cross-section. All right, so you guys have all seen this. If I push this guy, it stops because of friction. What do I need to do to keep it moving? I need to keep it pushing. Okay? Just like that. So if a fluid has viscosity, to keep the fluid moving, what you have to do is you have to have a pressure difference all along the pipe. Okay, so the pressure here has to be 120 millimeters of mercury, 110, 90, and so on. So if you have a viscous fluid, you have to maintain a pressure difference, okay, to keep pushing the fluid. All right, in viscous flow, something must apply a steady force equal and opposite to the viscous drag to push the viscous fluid through a tube at a steady average speed. That something is pressure. Okay. All right, so here is the equation. Again, you just have to have a sense for the equation. So if you want to keep this fluid moving through there, a viscous fluid, this pressure needs to be higher than this pressure, okay? So you have to maintain a pressure gradient. L is the length of the tube, okay? And the higher the pressure difference, you get a greater flow rate, okay? So the pressure difference is the force of the pressure divided by the area should equal the drag force and divided by the area of the tube. By the way, here is the drag force, okay? So this is the resistance force, and that's because of the viscosity, okay? Higher the viscosity, higher the drag force. Okay. All right, so for a viscous fluid, the pressure difference you have to maintain is this much. Okay, so you can see that in this equation, if the viscosity is 0, if it's a frictionless surface, you don't have to maintain any pressure difference. This would be 0. Once you get a fluid started, it'll just flow on its own. Yep.
And the pi r squared thing at the bottom there, what's the R stand for?
That's the radius of the pipe.
Okay.
Okay. So that's the area of cross section. So, and here's another important point. A larger pressure gradient is needed to move a fluid with greater viscosity. So greater the viscosity, the higher the pressure difference you have to maintain. A longer tube, and if the tube is smaller, R is smaller, then you have to maintain a greater pressure difference. Okay, so the same fluid, you don't need as much a pressure gradient to move it through a thicker tube. Okay, the narrower the tube, the greater the pressure difference you have to maintain. Okay. All right, so for a viscous flow, here's the flow rate. Flow rate is how many liters of fluid are flowing through per second. Here is the pressure difference between the end of the tube. There's the length of the tube. And this is the radius of the tube. And this is very important. Okay, so we'll look at this formula. Okay, now let's see what happens. Let's put some plaque in somebody's blood vessel. What did you do? You decrease the radius of the tube, effective radius of the tube. You decrease the radius, okay, so the blood flow rate decreased. What can you do to maintain the blood flow rate? I mean, if your brain or heart needs, some body part needs a blood flow rate of 2 liters a second, and there's plaque deposited in there, you want to maintain that blood flow rate, what can you do? The heart has to pump harder. It's got to work harder. Okay? And, after a while, maybe it doesn't want to work anymore. Okay? So that's a problem. Okay? So let's look at the effect. This is a huge effect. It's radius to the power 4. Okay? So this problem shows you the effect of that. If the radius decreases by 25%, and what we're going to calculate is if this reduces by 25%, and if you keep the pressure difference the same, if you don't change the pressure, let's see what the effect on the flow rate is. Okay. And this shows you the flow rate reduces to 32%. It decreases by 68%. So you reduce the radius by 25%, the flow rate reduces by 68%. Okay, that's the dramatic effect. And if you want to maintain the same flow rate, this has reduced by 25%, how much would you have to increase the pressure?
68%?
You have to increase the pressure by 3 times. Okay, so if instead of 120 millimeters of mercury, now you would have to have 360 millimeters of mercury. That's what it says. All right, so what does your body do when blood vessels to your heart get blocked? What does the body do? That's a very important organ. So it grows other blood vessels.
Bypass it?
Yep.
Grandmother had a clog
Mhm.
in her heart, and it developed what they called fingers, but the fingers came around the clog and literally connected together and created a round flow.
It's pretty amazing.
You embody well.
Yep.
I know, right?
It's very amazing. All right. All right. So, but you guys, this is a important formula. Okay. So it's dependent on the radius to the power 4. Okay. All right. Now this using this formula, we'll calculate the blood pressure in veins. Okay. Now, you guys know when you draw blood, where do you draw blood from?
Usually.
In your veins. Why don't they draw it from the arteries?
Because the pressure is too strong.
Yeah, so the pressure is too strong, and it would gush out like a fire hydrant. Okay? So, okay, this problem goes through that. Okay. Blood samples are taken from veins rather than arteries because the pressure is much lower as blood returns to the heart. Blood donors who give whole blood have a 6 millimeter long, 16 gauge needle, okay, inner diameter, inserted into their vein. 6 millimeters is about this, so the needle is about this long, and I guess the diameter is, inner diameter is 1 millimeter. Okay. So blood flows through the narrow diameter tube and needles is viscous. Okay, so they draw about half a liter of blood in 8 minutes. Okay, so that's what they're, okay. So what we are going to do is, so here's the needle, there's the vein, and there's the bag. And so half a liter is flowing in 8 minutes. Okay, and what we are going to do is calculate the pressure difference. So the pressure in the veins and the pressure in the bag. Okay. So the pressure difference needed across the needle is, so I've rearranged that other formula is that. Okay, there's the viscosity of the blood, there's the length of the needle, and this is the flow rate you want. This is the flow rate you want. Okay, and so the pressure difference across the needle that you need is 410 pascals. And then this is the pressure, so this is the needle, and then there's a tube connected to the bag. So let me move the bag, oops. And this tube is generally thick compared to the needle. Okay. Okay. So the pressure across the tubing that's needed is 640 pascals, and again, the same formula. The length of the tube is about 2 feet. Okay. Okay, so the total pressure decrease from the veins to there is 8 millimeters of mercury. Okay, and that's the pressure in your veins, roughly. In your arteries, it would be about 80 millimeters of mercury. That would be 10 times greater, and the flow rate would be 10 times greater. Except that you pull out that needle, what you'll have is a fountain. Okay? So, yeah, blood could be collected in 1/10 the time from a major artery, okay? But you know, you have a higher risk. There is no room for error there. Okay? Okay, now we'll talk about boundary layers. Okay, next time I want you to observe the following. Let's say it's a windy day, and you'll see leaves on the ground, and the leaves on the ground are not fluttering. Okay, so what's going on? Do you guys understand this? And the reason we're talking about this is, so it could be a windy day. I mean, a tall person gets blown away. But if you're a small animal, you don't even feel the wind. You don't feel the drag. You're not blown by the wind. Okay? So you can live your life as if nothing is happening, going on. Okay? So we want to talk about that. Terrestrial organisms no more than a few centimeters tall. A centimeter is about that much. Okay? Terrestrial organisms no more than a few centimeters tall hardly know that the wind is blowing. They spend their time in quiet refuge with little air motion. Okay. Aquatic organisms are somewhat more constrained, so you can have an ocean flowing and there could be a ledge. And if you're a tiny aquatic animal here, then the water doesn't push you. Okay. You don't have to hold on to things hard. Okay. Aquatic organisms are somewhat more constrained, but staying below a few millimeters in height, okay, so very tiny, is substantially reduces the drag from water flowing past. Okay. So you adapt to that environment. Okay, so now let's look at what is called the boundary layer. Okay, so so here's you could think of this wind as blowing. Okay, here's the free flow velocity. And then you hit a ledge. Okay, and here's what happens. This ledge stops, this air is hardly moving, and then the speed of the air increases with height. Okay, and then after a certain height, you have the same free flow velocity above the ledge. Okay, so this boundary layer is the layer where the speed of the air goes from 0 to 90% of the free flow velocity. Why does why does this matter? Like I said, if you're a tiny organism and if you're that tiny, you spend all your life never having to deal with wind. Okay? So, okay. So organisms that reside in the boundary layer experience less flow and less drag than organisms. So if you're living here, then you get blown around. Okay? So this is especially true towards the bottom of the boundary layer. So if you're living there, then you experience less drag in your life. Okay? Yeah. So for instance, if you're tiny like this and there's food here, you have no problem going across, walking against the wind there because you're not feeling the wind. Yeah. Mhm.
I don't know if you would know this, but if the organism is so small that it doesn't feel the wind blowing across it, it feels very little of that. They don't get the cooling effects of the air that we might get. Would their temperature have to regulate more without the use of the air cooling them down?
So here's the other side of the coin. If you're tiny, you're not generating enough heat. You need cooling because I need cooling because I'm generating a lot of heat. I'm generating 100 watts. Yeah. That's why babies, you have to make sure the babies are warm because they don't have as much, their surface area to volume is higher. They lose heat faster than I do. Yeah. You don't have, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is it, okay, so that boundary layer
Mm-hmm.
closest to a surface,
Mhm.
is that the organisms, the little bitty ones that
Mhm.
don't notice the wind and stuff?
Mhm.
Is it because there's more like surface contact with the surface? Because,
There's friction that's slowing the wind down. And this is a general thing.
oh, okay.
You
So there's
go
a
higher.
There's a friction window in there.
Yeah, yeah. That's slowing the air down. Have you gone to a high-rise building, a condominium and high up?
Mhm.
The wind is much higher.
You can sometimes feel the building sway a little
Yeah,
bit.
yeah. In fact, you have to build in, the Burj Khalifa?
Who?
The Burj Khalifa in Dubai, that tall building?
Oh, yeah.
That's about, I don't remember the exact height, but the top floor sways the width of this table.
And you can feel it. Wow.
Well, so how do you make sure that the windows don't pop out when the building is swaying?
You have to build
Make them out of
flexibility.
plexiglass?
So you gotta make sure of all that. So you have to put damper so it doesn't sway that much. In a top building, which floor is the most expensive? The top floor. Okay. If that person's hot coffee spills in the wind, you're not paying $50 million for that apartment. So you got to make sure of all that doesn't happen. So you have dampers in tall buildings. All right, so the boundary layer is important for tiny organisms. So boundary layer is defined as where the speed increases to 90% of the free flow velocity. Okay. So here's the height of the boundary layer. It's 3 times c. The viscosity, the higher the viscosity, greater the friction, it takes greater distance for the speed to increase. Okay? And it depends on how far you are from the edge of the ledge. Okay? And this is the density of the fluid. So the density of air is much smaller than the density of water. If it's water, the density of water is about 1,000 times greater. And this is the free flow velocity. So if the wind is blowing harder, the boundary layer is smaller. Okay. All right. For wind blowing at 10 to 12 miles an hour, so this is typical. You experience this easily around here. The boundary layers thickness from a few to 100 meters behind a ledge or a lip is a few centimeters. So at 10 to 12 miles an hour, the boundary layer is a few centimeters. So if you're 1 centimeter tall, even though the wind is blowing at 10 miles an hour, you don't feel it. Okay? So if you're tiny, you don't feel it. Okay? So terrestrial organisms no more than a few centimeters tall hardly know that the wind is blowing. Okay? Okay, now we'll talk about turbulence. Yep.
I think we have to thank the boundary layer for the fact that the bugs are not getting blown, because if they were experiencing the same amount of air that we are,
Mhm.
then there'd be flying fire ants, and that would suck.
Yeah, there you go, there you go.
They'd just be floating through the wind and land on you.
Right. All right, so now turbulence. Okay. Anytime a doctor uses his stethoscopes, they're listening for turbulence. And like I said, when you open a kitchen faucet and you hear the water flowing, that's turbulence. Okay? Except that if you hear turbulence in your body, that's a sign of trouble. Okay. All right, so you can see that this is laminar flow, and here's a good illustration. So this is dye, and dye has many molecules. See, when the flow is laminar, see neighboring drops are stay neighbors. When the flow becomes turbulent, and the flow will become turbulent if the fluid is flowing too fast. Okay. And if the flow becomes turbulent, see, the neighboring molecules are no longer neighbors. The flow is chaotic. Okay. Well, if the flow is turbulent, if you try and pump blood that is turbulent, it takes a lot more energy to pump that blood. Okay. So when the flow is turbulent, it doesn't move as easily. Okay. So you would have to work harder.
Wouldn't there have to be debris in your veins for there to be turbulence?
Plaque can cause turbulence. Okay, so if you have plaque, the blood is flowing faster, and above a critical speed, the flow becomes turbulent. Okay, so not all fluid flow is laminar. Okay. Many flowing fluids exhibit turbulence. Turbulent flow is characterized by chaotic changes in pressure and velocity. Whirlpools and eddies and vortices are common, and the fluid is well mixed. So the fluid is well mixed. Okay. All right, so here is laminar flow. You want laminar flow in your blood vessels. Here is turbulent flow. And you get turbulence if the fluid velocity increases above a certain amount. Okay, and there's something called the Reynolds number that tells you if the Reynolds number is below a certain number, then the flow will be laminar. And if the Reynolds number is above a certain number, the flow will become turbulent. And this Reynolds number, turbulence is, it's hard to calculate stuff in turbulence, so we don't understand turbulence too much. So this is all experimentally found. Okay. So in a tube, fluid flowing through a tube, it'll be laminar if the Reynolds number is below 2000. For a sphere moving through a fluid, the Reynolds number it has to be less than 1 for the flow to be turbulent. If the Reynolds number is above 1000, then the flow is turbulent over here. Okay. And what happens in between? Well, it slowly transitions from here to there to turbulence. Okay. So those calculations are hard. But these guys are experimentally found numbers. Okay, they're not calculated. Okay, so here's Reynolds number. Reynolds number, it's just a number. It depends on the density of the fluid, the speed at which the fluid is flowing, and L is the dimension of the thing. And so in this case, it's the diameter of the tube. And there's the viscosity. Okay, so you see, as V increases, the Reynolds number increases. As the speed of the fluid increases, the Reynolds number increases, and it transitions from laminar to turbulent flow. Okay. Anyway, for our purposes, you don't want blood flowing too fast. If the blood flows too fast, then it becomes turbulent. Okay. And what are the reasons where the blood can flow fast? Blockages. You put plaque in there, and this blood is flowing fast, and if it exceeds a critical speed, then you have problems. You have turbulent flow. So here's a problem. viscous fluids like honey tend to flow smoothly. So if viscosity is too high, then in general you're never going too fast, and the flow is always laminar. Okay. At high Reynolds number, by the way, Reynolds number is the ratio of inertial forces to viscous forces. Okay. So here's how you think about this. So how do you transition from laminar to turbulent flow? Okay. So think of this. So laminar flow, it's like a stampede of 1,000 closely packed cattle. It is smooth so long as every cow maintains absolutely the same velocity. Okay, so imagine you're trying to get a whole bunch of cattle into a pen. Every cow maintains the same velocity, but the slightest stumble causes the flow to break up. Okay, one cattle stumbles and it's chaos. Okay. Slightest stumble causes the flow to break up into a chaotic mess. So as the Reynolds number increases, there comes a point where the slightest irregularity, even just molecular diffusion, will cause turbulence. Okay. So there's no satisfactory theory for turbulence. It's an unsolved problem in classical physics. So not.
Is the E the natural E?
No, it's just a subscript.
It's just a lowercase e.
Mm-hmm. I have to look up why the subscript E, but that's the, or maybe it's the first two letters.
Yeah, just so that you don't confuse it with radius or something.
Yeah, but in physics, we are notorious for using the same R for everything. I mean, for a lot of different things. So you just have to understand what it means from the context. Okay. And I'll show you in a second. So there is no satisfactory theory for turbulence. Experimental measurements establish the relevant Reynolds numbers. Okay. So you just, if you want to study this tube, you just make a fluid flow and you increase the speed of the fluid and watch for when turbulence sets in. Okay, so the figure illustrates laminar and turbulent flow for fluid flowing through a circular tube and for a sphere moving through a fluid. So for instance, if the tube was a square cross-section, that Reynolds number would be different. This Reynolds number is for a circular cross-section tube. Okay. So Poiseuille's equation for flow through a circular tube, which assumes laminar flow, is valid only for Reynolds number less than 2000. Poiseuille's equation was this: 8 at r to the power 4. Oh, no. Okay, let me look it up. R to the power 4. Okay. This equation, so pi r to the power 4. Okay. Okay, this is this equation. The flow rate is valid only when the flow is laminar. Okay, when the flow becomes turbulence, to maintain the same flow rate, you would have to have a much larger pressure difference. So if the flow became turbulent, if blood was turbulently flowing all through your blood vessels, your heart would have to work much harder. Okay. So, fluid flow becomes fully turbulent above Reynolds number of 4,000 through a circular cross-section tube. Blood flow is normally laminar, but some pathologies disrupt the flow and create turbulence. So, thus, the detection and recognition of turbulence are important in diagnosis of a disease. So, anytime somebody is using a stethoscope, what are they doing? They're listening for turbulence. When their blood flowing, air flowing to your lungs is laminar normally. So, when a doctor is listening to your lungs, they're listening for turbulence. Okay. The passage of air through the respiratory system is laminar at modest respiratory rates. but can become turbulent as the airspeed increases at elevated respiratory rates. Okay, so you go for a sudden fast run and you're breathing harder. You could turn flow turbulent, and so just when you need more air, you're getting less air because it's become turbulent. Yeah. Turbulent flow is less efficient than laminar flow, which means that a given pressure gradient generates a smaller volume flow rate. A given pressure gradient generates a smaller flow rate. Okay. When the flow. Yeah. All right, now we'll talk about the circulatory system. Yeah. Okay, how do your cells get nutrients? How do your cells get oxygen? What process? Yep.
Diffusion.
Diffusion. Okay, so, and how does diffusion happen? Diffusion occurs lower what? Concentration. Okay. So if there's whatever there is, if this stuff is at a higher concentration and it's a lower concentration there, assuming this is a permeable membrane, this stuff will go over there. Okay. So, and greater the concentration difference, higher the flow rate. But this is a slow process, and it happens only, practically it happens only over small distances. So this is the last one. This is how everything is exchanged in your body. Okay? But this is a slow process, or only happening over small distances. So your body has to have plumbing to get this stuff to where it needs to go. That's the job of the circulatory system. That's the plumbing. Okay. Now here's another thing that you have to keep in mind. So this is toxins in the kidneys, let's say. In the kidneys, this is the blood, and the toxins, urea and stuff like that, have to be eliminated from your body. So they diffuse across there, okay? But at the same time, the good stuff is also going away. Okay, so let's say when urea goes away, glucose is also being eliminated. But that's energy molecules. Okay, so along with the bad stuff, the good stuff also diffuses. So what do you do?
Hopefully at least equilibrium is achieved.
So what you do is you spend money to bring it back. Hmm.
So it's a constant exchange happening
That's
between the organ and blood vessel.
Right. So you're spending energy to bring that stuff back. So if you're transporting something against the gradient, you have to spend energy. And that's called active transport. And when will you do that? Just like in the oil transport, if what you're spending is less than what you're getting, then you'll spend the money. Okay? So that kind of stuff is happening in your. Okay. But anyway, the circulatory system is your plumbing system. Okay. All right. So here's your heart. This is the right ventricle. Deoxygenated blood from the body comes here to the right atrium, gets sent to the right ventricle, and the right ventricle pumps this blood to the lungs. Okay. Here's your right lung, left lung. It gets oxygenated there and then comes back from the lungs to the right atrium, to the left atrium. That gets sent to the left ventricle, and from here you send that blood, oxygenated blood, to the whole body. And so that's a continuous process. Okay, the right ventricle is just sending blood to the lungs, which is not too far away. So this is a pump, but it doesn't have to be as strong. The left ventricle, on the other hand, has to send the blood through your entire body. Okay, the tube is much longer, so this pressure has to be much higher. The pressure that this guy generates, so this is a much stronger pump. These are your two pumps, but this is the stronger pump. Okay, so let me show you some numbers. Okay, So here, the right ventricle, see, it's sending, when it compresses to the lungs, it's sending blood at 25 millimeters of mercury. The left ventricle, when it's sending the blood to the entire body, it's got to generate a pressure of 120 millimeters of mercury. Okay.
You said so the pulmonary sending it to the lungs is 25?
Yeah, so the pressure when the blood comes out here. Okay. So that's just telling you this is not as strong a pump. By the way, these pressures are gauge pressures. They're not absolute pressures. Okay. What does it mean when you say it's a gauge pressure? So atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. So gauge pressure is absolute pressure minus the atmospheric pressure. Okay. So if you wanted the real pressure, you would add atmospheric pressure to the gauge pressure. So you would add 760 to 120 millimeters of mercury. Okay. So your real pressure there, the absolute pressure there is 880 millimeters of mercury. Yeah.
So it's real pressure minus the atmosphere?
Yeah. Okay, so that's, all these are gauge pressures. Okay, why do we always talk about gauge pressure? Because atmospheric pressure is already pushing you from the outside. So if you want to do anything, you have to have above that pressure. All right, so everything is gauge pressure. Okay, so what we learned is, this pump is about every 1 second your heart beats, and the contraction of the chambers of your heart send blood flowing through your body's arteries, capillaries, and veins. Okay? In larger vessels, the effect of viscosity is negligible. Okay, what does that mean? All right, so okay, this is 120 millimeters of mercury. That's the pressure in the aorta. When you go to the doctor's office and they measure your blood pressure, are they sticking something in there to measure the blood pressure? What are they doing? They're measuring the pressure in your arms. Okay, so what we are saying is, and you'll see, we'll give you the numbers okay, if the tube is wide, remember the tube is wide, the pressure doesn't drop too much. In fact, the pressure that drops from here to your arms is only about 1 millimeters of mercury because this tube is thick. And so as long as the pressure in your arm is being measured at the heart level, that is proxy for the pressure at the heart. Okay? So that's what that means. So in larger vessels, the effect of, so let me write down that equation. Q is, flow rate is pi r to the power 4. Okay, if the radius of the blood vessel is quite large, okay, you don't need as great a pressure difference to maintain a flow rate. Okay, so the pressure drop from the heart to your arm is not, like I said, only 1 millimeter because that tube is pretty wide. Okay, the brachial artery is wide. So the cardiovascular system consists of 2 pumps, the left ventricle and the right ventricle, and a complex arrangement of vessels that transport blood. The purpose of any pump is to create pressure in the fluid. Okay, so when that contracts, the pressure increases to 120 millimeters of mercury and the blood squirts out. Okay. The left side of the heart pumps blood through the rest of the circulatory system, returning it to the right side of the heart, where the process begins again. Okay. Heart valves open and close by pressure differences. So all valves are one-way valves. Okay, so if you have a valve like this, so let's say the valve is like this, and when the pressure is higher here, the valve is closed, and when the pressure is higher here, the valve opens. Okay, so okay, let me. Okay, when the pressure is higher here, the valve will open. When the pressure is higher here, the valve will close. Okay. So they're all one-way valves. In addition, the valves between atria and ventricle, to assist in opening, they have threads that attach like that that'll pull back and open it even wider. Okay. Blood is nearly incompressible. Okay. The major features of the circulatory systems are two sides of the heart, the lungs and the arteries. Blood is pumped into the aorta, the largest artery in the body, by the left ventricle. Okay. And the aorta branches into major arteries, which branch into arterioles and capillaries. Okay. The right atrium pumps blood into the right ventricle. Okay, so you can read all of that. Okay, so here is the flow rate. Now, this is not the radius of anything, so this is the same R, but this R is resistance. Okay, so resistance to flow. Greater the resistance to flow, greater the pressure difference you need to maintain a certain flow rate. Okay. So the resistance to flow is 8 times the viscosity times L, and this is the radius of the tube. Okay. All right, so look at this here. This thing shows you all kinds of pressure at various locations. Okay, so I'll point to something interesting. So here's the pressure in the aorta. It's 120 millimeters of mercury. Again, these are all gauge pressures. By the time you get to the capillaries, it's 35 millimeters of mercury. Again, whatever direction the blood is flowing, upstream the pressure has to be higher and downstream the pressure is lower. Okay? When you get to the venule end of the capillaries, the pressure is dropped to 15 millimeters of mercury. And look at it, just before entering the right atrium, the pressure is dropped to 4 millimeters of mercury. All right, so here's the question for you. Let's say blood is flowing at 5 liters a second here. Okay. What is the blood flow rate here? 5 liters a second. Okay. The pressure drop here, look at that. That's almost 40 millimeters of mercury. Look at the pressure drop here. It's 10 millimeters of mercury. You have a pressure drop of only 10 millimeters of mercury. Here you have 40 millimeters of mercury. How are you going to maintain the same flow rate? No, well, you're not pumping harder, you're pumping weaker. Resistance has to decrease. How does resistance decrease? If the radius of the tube is higher. This tube is twice as wide as that guy. And that's how you get the same flow rate. So the body evolves such that this large vein is twice the area of cross-section of the aorta. So let me show you that number. So the area of the cross-section, total cross-section area of the aorta is 3 centimeters square. For the vena cava, the largest vein, is 7 centimeters. Okay, so that's how you do it. This is, and why did you do that? If this was the same size as that, you would have to maintain the same pressure difference. You would have to start off with a much higher pressure here. Your heart would have to work harder. You wouldn't get the 2 billion beats that you deserve, right? So it's a beautifully designed system, I guess. So since the pressure is lower here, you just make this pipe wider. Yep. All right. There's only a small pressure drop in the venous system from the capillaries back to the heart. This is because the 2 major veins returning blood to the right side of the heart are each larger than the aorta. Okay? So the veins are larger than the aorta. And the right side of the heart increases blood pressure. Okay. So here's the pressure at here's the areas of cross-section. And now let me point out one thing. I need to point out two things before we stop. Okay. All right. So here is the area of cross-section of the aorta. That's the area of cross-section of this guy. The total area of cross-section of the capillaries is 4,000 centimeters squared. So it goes from roughly 4 centimeters squared to 4,000 centimeters squared. The area of cross-section in the capillaries increases by a factor of 1,000. Why did that happen?
Because the diffusion needs to cover more surface area to be able to diffuse what's in the blood.
Okay, so here is a, okay, so remember V1, area 1, V2, area 2. V1A1 equal to V2, area 2. Okay, the blood, so roughly the blood coming out of here roughly is 30 centimeters a second. That's the speed of the blood. That is too fast. If blood were flowing that fast in the capillaries, there would be no time for diffusion. In the capillaries, the blood is flowing at 3 centimeters, 0.03 centimeters a second. Okay, so if you divide this by 1,000, okay, 1, 2, 3, you get this guy.
Is it centimeters or millimeters, the cross-section measurement? You said it's 1,000 times, cross-section of capillaries 1,000 times out of an artery. Is it measured in centimeters or millimeters?
Oh, it does, well, hang on a second. So this is the speed of the blood coming out of the aorta. This is the speed of the blood in the capillaries. Okay, the speed in the capillaries is 1,000 times slower than in the aorta. So now you come back to this equation. If you want to reduce the speed by a factor of 1,000 in the capillaries, you have to increase the total area of cross-section by 1,000. And that's what you did. See? So you had so many capillaries, and the total area of cross-section of all the capillaries added up to that much. The reason was you wanted to slow down the blood.
Yes,
Right, but-
is it measured in centimeters or millimeters?
Centimeters
Every
squared.
other- All of your measurements have been in millimeters
Mhm.
for the flow up until now, and then just now you said centimeters.
Oh, yeah, well, I mean, this is,
Was it millimeters or centimeters?
no, this is, the area of cross-section is centimeters squared.
Okay, that's what I was asking.
Yeah, no, it says there, right there.
I
That's
can't, I mean, I'm blind.
You're blind.
It's very tiny, okay.
It's very tiny from here.
It was a good question, though.
Yeah, because I wasn't 100% sure.
Yep.
if you had said
So,
millimeters.
but anyway, the important point is, you want to slow down flow, then you have to increase the area of cross-section. So this is what you want to remember. You want to slow down the fluid, you have to increase the area of cross-section of the pipe, okay? And so that's what effectively you do by having so many capillaries and stuff like that, by the way. So, so here are the dimensions of the capillary. Many of the blood's duties are performed in capillaries, including the removal of waste product and the transport of nutrients and oxygen to the cells. Why do you need oxygen, by the way?
To enrich the blood.
Hmm?
To enrich the blood to reach the heart and the brain.
No, why do you need
To
oxygen?
keep all the cells alive.
Okay, so everything is, so again, I added these slides. This is, so the oxygen allows cells, so you take oxygen, you need oxygen because from nutrients, you're making ATP molecules. This is the battery of your body. This is the energy-giving molecule. To extract the most amount of energy from nutrients, you need oxygen. If you don't combine oxygen with the nutrients, you squeeze out all the energy from the nutrients. That's why you need oxygen, okay? Oxygen allows to extract the maximum amount of energy from nutrients. Okay? Without it, cells must rely on anaerobic respiration. Without oxygen, you rely on other reactions to extract energy from nutrients, which is much less efficient. So if you didn't have oxygen, you're leaving money on the table. Okay? And you don't want to do that. Now here's an amazing number. Okay, so when you use an ATP molecule, so when you use an ATP molecule, what you end up doing is converting it to ADP or something like that, plus energy that is used in various processes, okay? And then what do you do with the ADP? Then you convert it back into ATP. Then you convert it back to ATP by spending energy, okay? So you regenerate your body's weight of worth of ATP every day. Yes, so that gives you a sense for the energy that goes on. Okay, so all right. One more slide and we'll end. Okay, so to slow blood down, okay, and by the way, when the area increases by a factor of 1,000, the speed decreases by a factor of 1,000. And there's a problem, okay, so okay. Many of the blood's duties are performed in the capillaries, including removal of waste products. Capillaries are 5 to 20 micrometers in diameter. The micrometer is roughly the size of a cell, okay? So that gives you the process of diffusion, osmosis, dialysis, and active transport happen across capillary walls. What is active transport? You're moving stuff from lower concentration to higher concentration. And what do you have to do that? I'm sorry? Yep, you have to spend energy, okay? So every time your neurons fire, potassium has gone from inside your nerve cell to the outside, and you have to bring back those potassium back, okay? So you have to use active transport. And so ion transport, 20% of your energy is spent on ion transport, okay? And incoming arteriole branches into capillaries. Okay. By the way, sphincter muscles can control flow. Okay. So here is if you want to control flow, you reduce the radius. If you want to increase flow, you increase the radius. So for instance, if you, after lunch, blood to your stomach increases by a factor of 5. Okay. And if you want to see the effect of that, after a meal, play chess, which I do all the time online, and I lose all the time after lunch, heavy lunch or whatever. So, I got to play chess on an empty stomach. So, pathways through capillary beds are often tortuous and interwoven, giving blood the considerable latitude. Again, I wanted to mention something. Okay, so velocity of blood is much greater, is about 30 centimeters coming out of the aorta than in capillaries, which is 0.03 centimeters. Blood velocity increases again when the capillary rejoin in the vein. By the way, so it's 30 centimeters per second here, and here it's about 15 centimeters per second because this area is twice that area. So when blood is going back to the heart, it's going at about 15 centimeters a second. This is 30 seconds. Okay. There's a problem that I was trying to tell you, but well, maybe. Oh yeah, here we go. Okay. There's about 10 billion capillaries in the human body, giving a capillary every few cells on the average. So there's a capillary is about 1 millimeter long, and for every few cells there's a capillary. Stuff diffuses into the interstitial fluid and then goes to the cells. Okay. Remember, diffusion is a slow process, and the blood slowed down in the capillary And it turns out that blood spends about 5 seconds in each capillary. So that's enough time for diffusion to happen. Okay? And we'll look at that in a problem somewhere. Okay? So remember, the blood slowed down in the capillaries, so you have enough time for diffusion, and blood ends up spending about 5 seconds. So here's the calculation. So the speed of blood in the capillaries is about 2 millimeters per second, and the distance it covers is 1 millimeter. So time is distance over speed, 1 millimeter over 0.2 millimeters per second. That's 5 seconds. Okay. So that's the time spent by the capillaries, blood in the capillaries.